Hello students, welcome to slide set 2. In this particular slide set, we will be talking about fat soluble vitamins. Now, for this particular part of the lecture, what we are going to look at are the 4 fat soluble vitamins A, E, D and K. And we will focus on the source of these vitamins. We will talk briefly about the metabolism of these vitamins. Then we will look at the function of these vitamins, and while we were discussing the functions, we will also look at some of the clinical aspects that are relevant for you for the assessment. So we start with the first vitamin, vitamin A. Now, vitamin A is derived from cod liver oil, dairy products and egg yolk. Now there are different molecular forms of vitamin A which are shown in this particular part of the slide. There is a form which has a terminal alcohol group which is called retinol. There is a form that has a terminal aldehyde group which is called retinal. And there is a form that has a terminal carboxylic acid group which is called the retinoic acid. Now if I look at the structure of retinol and retinoic acid, I will see that it mostly consists of hydrocarbons with a terminal functional group that is charged. Because all these molecular forms are rich in hydrocarbon, you can logically deduce that vitamin A or all the forms of vitamin A are therefore non-polar or hydrophobic. And this is the reason vitamin A is a fat-soluble vitamin. The provitamin or the precursor of vitamin A is beta-carotene. And beta-carotene, for your information, is found in dark green leafy yellow vegetables. And one of the rich sources of beta-carotene are carrots. However, we also are able to synthesize vitamin A or the molecular forms of vitamin A from retinol esters, and this conversion is taking place in the small intestine. Now, if a person takes excess amounts of beta carotene in the diet, he or she will have yellow coloration of the skin, which is similar to what we observe when a person suffers from jaundice. But what distinguishes excess of beta carotene from jaundice is that in case of jaundice, the sclera of the eye becomes yellow, whereas in case of a diet rich in beta carotene, the sclera remains white. Now, I mentioned here that beta carotene and retinol esters derived from the diet are converted to retinol in the small intestine, and also in the small intestine this retinol is converted to retinol esters. Now these retinol esters are then packaged in the lipoproteins chylomicron particles, and I believe you have already heard the term chylomicron when you took the exogenous and endogenous pathway for lipoprotein metabolism. And these chylomicrons, which take up retinol esters, transport these esterified retinol to the hepatocytes for storage. Now, if there is a requirement of retinol by any cell, this retinol is released from the hepatocyte in complex with a particular protein which is called retinol binding protein. And this retinol binding protein actually helps to solubilize retinol, which is predominantly hydrophobic, and transport it throughout the body to the cells that require retinol, except the heart and the skeletal muscle. Once retinol reaches the cytosol, it is converted to retinoic acid, and this conversion is an irreversible process. And then this retinoic acid, just like some of the steroid hormones that you have studied in endocrine system, binds to nuclear receptors, and by binding to nuclear receptors, it activates transcription of specific genes that mediate different physiological function, or more precisely, the proteins that are synthesized on upregulation of a specific gene mediate various physiological function. So that gives you an overview of the molecular forms of vitamin A, the synthetic process which is involved, and also the transport and the mechanism of action involved in vitamin A activity. Now, what are the functions of vitamin A? And as we discuss the functions, we are also going to talk about what happens if vitamin A is deficient. So, I believe you all know that vitamin A is an important component of the visual pigments within rod and cone cells of the retina. And if a person suffers from deficiency of vitamin A, he or she suffers from a condition known as xerophthalmia. And this condition is very common in children. And in xerophthalmia, what happens? The sclera becomes dry, and if the condition is not treated, the person or the child who is suffering from the deficiency develops a telltale phenotypic feature known as Bitort's spot. As you can see here, this is shown here with the arrow. So this is the Bitort spot, which tells you specifically that this person is suffering from vitamin A deficiency. And you all know that xerophthalmia progresses and causes night blindness. Now, if this particular condition is not treated, then it will progress into keratomalacia. And keratomalacia is the softening of the sclera, as you can see here. Softening of the cornea, as you can see here, shown here with this particular arrow. And if this condition is not managed properly by supplementing the diet with vitamin A, it will lead to permanent blindness. And you can see here what happens if the condition remains untreated. So, vitamin A is an important vitamin that helps in vision. Also, vitamin A is important in normal cell differentiation and prevents epithelial cells from undergoing squamous metaplasia. Now, what is squamous metaplasia? It is the non-cancerous metaplasia of surface lining cells. For your information, you will observe squamous metaplasia more often in the airway tract of people who smoke extensively. The third important function is related to immunity. There are various studies out there which shows that vitamin A, if deficient in the diet, leads to immunosufficiency. Vitamin A is also important for normal bone and tooth development. Of course, it is not as important as vitamin D, but still, deficiency can lead to impairment of bone and tooth development. Further, it supports spermatogenesis and placental growth. Now, there are various drugs out there which are used to treat skin disorders and also acute promyelocytic leukemia. These drugs actually consist of different molecular forms of vitamin A, and this is actually listed here for your information in this particular part of the slide. Now, apart from dietary insufficiency, when you will encounter deficiency of vitamin A, and one of the important reasons for deficiency of vitamin A is insufficiency of pancreatic function. This is because pancreatic enzymes, especially pancreatic lipase, assists or facilitates digestion of lipids. And since vitamin A is a lipid-soluble vitamin, if there is an insufficiency of pancreatic function, it will also affect the absorption of vitamin A, as we have seen in the previous slide, leading to its deficiency. Recently, a drug was introduced called Orlistat. It's a drug that is marketed by GlaxoSmithKline and has been approved for the treatment of obesity. Now, this drug is a potent pancreatic lipase inhibitor. So what happens is, if the person takes the drug, pancreatic lipase is inhibited and there is insufficient digestion of lipids. And the binding efficiency of the drug with pancreatic lipase is approximately 99%. So it's a very potent inhibitor of pancreatic lipase, and if this drug is prescribed to a subject to manage obesity, one should be careful to monitor the levels of vitamin A as well as other fat-soluble vitamins, because the absorption of vitamin A will be impaired, and if the diet is not supplemented sufficiently with vitamin A, this person will suffer from vitamin A deficiency. So, conditions which affect pancreatic function will also affect the absorption and in turn the function of vitamin A. Now, being a lipid-soluble vitamin, vitamin A in excess in the diet can also lead to toxicity. Sorry. And one of the most common toxicity or common toxicity that is observed is in people in the Arctic region who are in the habit of eating polar bear liver. And since polar bear liver contains excess of vitamin A, these people suffer from vitamin A toxicity, which also, for some unknown reason, causes squamous metaplasia and other physiological effects. So that is in summary the function of vitamin A and what happens if there is an insufficiency or if there is a deficiency of vitamin A because of either deficiency in the diet or because of insufficiency of lipid digestion. So we move on and we move to the next vitamin, which is vitamin E. Now, vitamin E has been a subject of study because many people believe that vitamin E prevents atherosclerosis. So we will focus on that particular aspect, but in general, it's an easy vitamin to study. So in vitamin E, alpha tocopherol has the highest biological activity of the naturally occurring tocopherols that constitute vitamin E and is abundant in fruits, vegetables and grains. Especially green leafy vegetables are rich source of vitamin E. And the key function of vitamin E is that it is an antioxidant, as well as it acts as a scavenger of free radicals. So what vitamin E does is that it protects polyunsaturated fats and fatty acids in cell membranes from lipid peroxidation. It also protects low density lipoprotein from oxidation. So what happens is that if the oxidation of LDL cholesterol is impaired, there will be lesser formation of foam cells during atherosclerosis. And this is the reason, as I said, vitamin E is considered as an atheroprotective vitamin. Now you all know that our erythrocytes are in an oxygen-rich environment, and because of being in an oxygen-rich environment, they produce considerable amounts of superoxide radicals. Vitamin E has been shown to protect erythrocytes from oxidative damage by neutralizing these superoxide radicals, and therefore it is considered that vitamin E prevents hemolysis. And you remember when we took pentose phosphate pathway, we studied this particular mechanism which the body has, where it uses reduced glutathione to prevent hemolysis, where reduced glutathione is responsible for neutralizing the superoxide radicals, a feature that is impaired in people who suffer from glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. So, vitamin E supplements may help people who suffer from glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. And this is sometimes used as a clinical vignette or a scenario in exam questions. And therefore, if somebody asks you that if a person is suffering from glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency and a particular vitamin is supplemented in the diet of that particular person, then he or she is talking about vitamin E. Now, in general, vitamin E deficiency is uncommon. However, it occurs primarily in children especially who are suffering from cystic fibrosis and A beta lipoproteinemia, where there is impaired absorption of fats, in turn affecting the absorption of lipid soluble vitamins. So, in these children who are suffering from either of these conditions, there is malabsorption of vitamin E, which may lead to deficiency of vitamin E in these children. However, vitamin E deficiency is uncommon. Now, one should be careful because people sometimes take mega doses of vitamin E supplements in their diet, and this may lead to vitamin E toxicity. We move on to a very important vitamin, vitamin D. You may have studied vitamin D synthesis when you took the function of parathyroid hormone, but we will talk about the synthesis of vitamin D and its transport quickly to recap some of the important facts. Now, liver, egg yolk, saltwater fishes are the major sources of vitamin D. Now, there are two ways vitamin D comes into our physiological environment. One is through intestinal absorption, and in this case, we have argocalciferol, which is D2, and during and following absorption, argocalciferol is converted to cholecalciferol. Of course, you need to remember that conversion of D2 to D3 is a bidirectional reaction. However, the major source of vitamin D is from the skin, where 7-dehydrocholesterol in the presence of UV light present in the sunlight is converted to cholecalciferol, that is D3. And as I said here, and I mentioned this in the slide, and you should remember this, that it is the most important source of vitamin D. Now, cholecalciferol in the liver is converted by the enzyme 25-hydroxylase within the cytochrome P450 system present in the hepatocyte to 25-hydroxycholecalciferol, and the process stops here. Now, 25-hydroxycholecalciferol is then transported to the kidney, where it undergoes a second hydroxylation reaction catalyzed by the enzyme 1-alpha-hydroxylase, and you may have heard of this enzyme because it is regulated by the parathyroid hormone, and this enzyme catalyzes the conversion of 25-hydroxycholecalciferol to its dihydroxy form, that is 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. And this reaction is occurring specifically in the proximal tubules of the kidneys. And as I told you, this particular hormone is regulated by the parathyroid hormone, which actually increases the synthesis of 1-alpha-hydroxylase. Therefore, parathyroid hormone facilitates the conversion of 25-hydroxycholecalciferol to the active 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. Now, 125 dihydroxycholecalciferol then is transported to different parts of the body where we have the receptors for vitamin D, and by binding to the receptor, this particular form of vitamin D brings about a plethora of changes. And I'm not going to talk about that because I believe during bone metabolism and calcium metabolism, which you have taken in endocrinology, these aspects would have been discussed in relative detail. But what you need to know that the receptors for vitamin D are located in the intestine, the kidney, and most importantly on the osteoblasts in the bone. That is the reason vitamin D is important for mineralization of bone. And in children who suffer from a deficiency of vitamin D, it leads to reduced bone density, a condition that is termed as rickets. So let us try to summarize the function of vitamin D. As I said, vitamin D is an important vitamin. Some people even treat it as a hormone and teach it in endocrinology. So you may have studied this along with parathyroid hormone and calcium metabolism, which is one of the important functions of parathyroid hormone. So vitamin D increases intestinal absorption of calcium and also phosphorus, and specifically renal absorption of calcium. So absorption of calcium and phosphorus provides an adequate solubility product which actually relates to the function of vitamin D in bone formation. Now, when vitamin D or 125 dihydroxycholecalciferol, as we saw in the previous slide, interacts with its receptors on osteoblasts, a particular enzyme called alkaline phosphatase is released, and this particular enzyme promotes bone mineralization. Briefly, what alkaline phosphatase does is that it hydrolyzes pyrophosphate, and this pyrophosphate is an inhibitor of bone mineralization. So by hydrolyzing this pyrophosphate, it attenuates the pyrophosphate and promotes bone mineralization. Since children who are in their growing phase require increased bone mineralization, it is seen that alkaline phosphatase is 3 to 5 times higher in children than in adults. And I mentioned that you may have studied vitamin D along with the function of parathyroid hormone or the mechanism of activity of parathyroid hormone. So, in combination with parathyroid hormone, vitamin D increases the mobilization of calcium from bone by stimulating the conversion of monocyte stem cells in the marrow to osteoclasts. And also, along with parathyroid hormone, it maintains the serum calcium concentration. Now, vitamin D, if you remember, go back to what we studied in biochemistry. The precursor of vitamin D is cholesterol. And for the process of cholesterol synthesis, you require the hexose monophosphate shunt pathway or the pentose phosphate pathway. Patients who are deficient in the enzyme glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase produce less amount of NADPH, which is essential for cholesterol biosynthesis. Therefore, these subjects will also have deficiency of vitamin D. So this is something that I have not mentioned because you have studied it in the biochemistry course in semester 1 of phase 1. But what are the causes for the deficiency of vitamin D? First is inadequate exposure to sunlight, and this is, as I have mentioned, UV is required for the synthesis of vitamin D. So if there is inadequate exposure, there is decreased synthesis of cholecalciferol, and this is one of the key reasons why people in the Middle East suffer from deficiency of vitamin D, because there is an inadequate exposure to sunlight. We are all the time in the air conditioning. Few of us go out in the sunlight, or few of us are working outside, and therefore exposure to UV is very, very less. The second most important reason is fat malabsorption. Again, the logic behind that is the same as what I mentioned for vitamin A. So there is impairment of reabsorption of fat soluble vitamins, and one of the diseases that is responsible for this is the celiac disease. Then we have chronic liver disease, where there is also a deficiency of vitamin A, because the first hydroxylation in the process of vitamin D synthesis occurs in the liver. Now, sometimes certain drugs and chemicals increase the activity of the cytochrome P450 system, and if the activity of the cytochrome P450 system is increased, there is increased conversion of the monohydroxylated form of cholecalciferol to an inactive metabolite. Therefore, people who are chronic alcoholics often suffer from vitamin D deficiency. Of course, there are drugs such as barbiturates where there is also deficiency of vitamin D. The most common cause of vitamin D, however, is renal failure, because as you have seen, the process of synthesis or the active form of vitamin D that is required for physiological activity is synthesized in the proximal tubules of the kidney. So in renal failure, because the second hydroxylation cannot take place due to deficiency of 1-alpha hydroxylase enzyme, there is impairment in the synthesis of the dihydroxylated form or the active form of cholecalciferol that leads to insufficiency of vitamin D activity. The other important cause is hyperparathyroidism, and you can directly see here parathyroid hormone activates 1-alpha hydroxylase. So if there is insufficient parathyroid hormone synthesis, 1-alpha hydroxylase doesn't get activated, and the second hydroxylation reaction in the proximal tubules does not take place. Now, there are two types of deficiencies that people suffer from, and as I said, vitamin D deficiency leads to a condition called rickets. We can classify rickets into type 1 and type 2. So type 1 vitamin D dependent rickets is caused by deficiency of 1-alpha hydroxylase, and type 2 vitamin D dependent rickets is caused because of the deficiency of vitamin D receptors in the target tissues. Nobody knows why there is a deficiency of vitamin D receptors in the target tissues, but there are a lot of hypotheses. For example, people who are suffering from type 2 diabetes, they have lesser expression of vitamin D receptors, and therefore sometimes they suffer from insufficiency of vitamin D function, because although they are producing the active form of vitamin D, due to the absence of the receptor, the vitamin D cannot mediate its physiological effects. So this is a summary of vitamin D deficiency. Of course, I didn't mention one aspect, that is deficiency by dietary deficiency of vitamin D, which happens of course in countries which are financially not well off, where the deficiency is observed mostly in children, because vitamin D is required more in children because of increased bone mineralization. And the telltale signs is that these children who are deficient in vitamin D, they suffer from rickets. We come down to vitamin K, which is the last vitamin of the fat soluble group. And vitamin K, the most important source of vitamin K are green leafy vegetables, which consist of vitamin K1, a molecular form known as phyloquinone, and the second molecular form known as vitamin K2 or menaquinone is synthesized in the colon by our intestinal flora. Now, after absorption in the bowel, vitamin K is oxidized to form an inactive epoxide. Most of the vitamin K that our body uses comes from bacterial synthesis by colonic bacteria. So if somebody is taking a broad spectrum antibiotic for some kind of a disorder, he or she should take vitamin K supplements, as broad spectrum antibiotics also kill the intestinal bacteria. So to be catalytically active, vitamin K synthesized by colonic bacteria must be reduced by a particular enzyme called epoxide reductase in the hepatocytes. So let us try to quickly look at the function. The most important function of vitamin K is that it facilitates carboxylation, or more precisely gamma carboxylation of glutamic acid residues. And you know that gamma carboxylation is an important event that is required especially for coagulation factors prothrombin, factor 7, factor 9, factor 10 and proteins C and S, because gamma carboxylation of these coagulation factors allows these coagulation factors to bind to calcium, and if there is no vitamin K, there will be no gamma carboxylation, no calcium binding, and there will not be any clot formation, and therefore calcium, if there is vitamin K deficiency, people suffer from bleeding disorders. Now, coumarin derivatives, which are anticoagulants, they are inhibiting the activity of epoxide reductase. So there is a deficiency of vitamin K dependent coagulation factors, or vitamin K is produced less. So there is lesser gamma carboxylation, lesser calcium binding, and therefore there is less coagulation happening, less formation of fibrin clots, and that is the reason you get this anticoagulant effect. But remember that a person who are put on vitamin K dependent anticoagulants should be monitored carefully for bleeding disorders. Vitamin K to some extent functions in bone calcification because gamma carboxylation of glutamate residues is important for osteocalcin. Now, vitamin K deficiency is a very rare phenomenon but often may happen, as I said, by the repeated use of broad spectrum antibiotics which destroy the colonic bacterial synthesis of the vitamin, and therefore people who are taking broad spectrum antibiotics over prolonged period of time should be prescribed vitamin K supplements. This is a cheat sheet for you guys to look at the signs and symptoms of deficiency for the fat soluble vitamins and the signs and symptoms of excess for the fat soluble vitamins. Now, I'm not going to ask you directly questions from this particular aspect, but as I said, some of the terms that are used in the vignettes will help you to identify a specific vitamin or its insufficiency. So I will urge you to look at this particular table carefully once you are studying this particular slide set. So we move on to the third slide set. We will talk about certain clinical correlations. So this is actually part of your tutorial. In this particular slide set, I will give you 5 problems. You should try to solve the problems first on your own. And once you have solved them, then there is a short video on how to come to the correct answer by looking at the distractors and what is the reason for the correct answer that is selected. So after you have finished studying this, please take some time to go through the third slide set. Thank you very much.